Hello, good afternoon. Hello, dear souls. My name is Jeff Koshin West, founder of Integral Transformative Bodywork. My pronouns are he, him. I welcome you to another ITB Sunday School. Here we are. All right, so it is September. It is cold now here in Georgia. We had a cold break last night, and it's cold. So that's awesome. I had a great night's sleep, and I love the cold, and I'm totally here for it. Today, it's September. Let me start over again. Okay, it's September. This month at ITB Sunday School, we are focusing on the two foundational practices of ITB. The two foundational integral transformative bodywork are shadow work and witness consciousness meditation, WCM. So last week we talked about why WCM is important, is considered a foundational practice, and how WCM contributes to full recovery as well as personal transformation. So this week we are looking at how shadow work contributes to full recovery and personal transformation. So a little disclaimer, hey, we've talked about shadow work a lot. Shadow work in ITB is super duper important to us. It's one of those things that's not a lot of people are clear about. It's one of those things where there's not a whole lot of conversation about shadow work. And in my opinion, there's a lot of people that talk about shadow work, but don't always emphasize how important it is to the personal transformation process or the recovery process. There's a lot of talk about shadow work, but there's not a lot of talk about what shadow work is and why you need to do it on a regular basis. There's not, in my opinion, there's simply just not enough attention given to it. So in ITB so far with Sunday schools, we've already kind of had a hard focus on shadow work. We spent a whole month talking about shadow work. Today I'm going to talk about shadow work that has to do with this specific conversation of why it's a foundational practice and how it contributes to full recovery and personal transformation specifically. So if you're looking for more in-depth conversation about shadow and shadow work, I would suggest going back to those other videos and checking out those guys. It's like I said, it's a whole month. So it's a lot more in depth. It literally, one of the videos or one of the Sunday schools is literally just a walkthrough about how to do shadow work with voice work and different things along those lines with voice dialogue and all that. So I highly recommend that. If you are wanting to do a little bit more of a deep dive into what shadow work is, then I would suggest going in that direction. This is going to be a conversation where I'm already assuming you know a little bit about shadow work. I'm already assuming there's a little bit of an understanding of what shadow work is. And then we're going to take that information and we're going to apply it to how it helps with personal transformation and how it works with full recovery. So this dialogue is definitely not going to be the deepest of dialogues having to do with shadow work, but we're going to still touch on some topics. And if you have no clue about what shadow work is, it would probably be helpful. You'll probably get some good information out of this video, but it'd probably be more helpful to learn more about shadow work from those old videos. So I would suggest going through our YouTube channel and finding those videos. I believe it was either July. I believe it was July that we jumped into shadow work. I think that's what we did. It was either July or August. It wasn't a long time ago. So one of those months should have all that shadow work stuff going on. Okay, so please check that stuff out if you're wanting deeper conversation. So today we're going to get into, last week we talked about why witness consciousness meditation supports full recovery and personal transformation. So today we're going to talk about why shadow work and a shadow practice contributes to full recovery and personal transformation. So first and foremost, let's jump into what the heck is shadow work? So let's define that real quick. A quick little synopsis on what is shadow work. So shadow work is a term that sprouted out of Western psychology. It is touched on by Freud. It was very much talked about by Jung. Carl Jung, I guess, probably did the most to kind of talk up the topic of shadow. He definitely did push the envelope much more than Freud on what shadow was and kind of related to shadow in a different way. Shadow itself, the easiest definition is anything that is a part of our humanity, part of our makeup as a human, that has been disowned. And disowned means that I don't acknowledge it as a part of me. I don't acknowledge it as a quality. So you can kind of, we in ITB, we split that which we can disown. We split shadow into two general categories. First and foremost, it's elements of us, the natural elements of our humanity that we can disown. And when it comes to the natural elements of our humanity, we usually point to the integral map popularized by Ken Wilber. So if we're going to say something as bold as there are these elements that a human is made up of, there needs to be like a map of those elements, right? So the map of those elements is the integral map. So in our opinion, in my opinion as a explorer of integral theory, as well as others, or in the academic community and the psychotherapeutics, that's my sweetheart sneezing in the background there. If you can hear that, I don't even know if you can hear that, but she's like really going for it. Anyhow, what the hell was I saying? Oh yeah, as far as integral map is concerned, when we're thinking about the integral elements or what the basic makeup of a human being is, the integral map is a beautiful representation of that. We call those elements are natural elements of being a human being, or natural phenomena of being a human being. What every human being is made up of. Every human being has everything on the integral map, no matter what. And so every human being is made up of these basic foundational elements. And so you can disown any of those elements, right? And then also the other category that usually comes up, we have the elements of our humanity, but the other thing that we usually disown is trauma. Trauma is stuff that's usually going to be, we define trauma as anything that overwhelms the human being or overwhelms the systems of a human experience. And everybody's trauma is signature. There are some objective ways to look at trauma. One of the objective ways to look at trauma is based off of how severe the perception of the trauma was, or how intense the trauma was. So we could talk about, this in a context of lowercase t trauma and a capital T trauma. So a little t and a big T, right? So a little t trauma would be something what most of us wouldn't even probably consider a trauma. You just got hurt and you recovered. Okay, so maybe you stubbed your toe, maybe you burned yourself, maybe you cut yourself, maybe you sprained an ankle, and it wasn't that bad. Maybe you like I said, maybe you bumped into something, had a minor car accident. These still overwhelm the system to a certain extent because the system has collapsed, right? So if I twist my ankle and if I overwhelm a tendon, that's called a strain, right? So if I overwhelm a tendon, then the tendon has been pushed beyond its capabilities and it's torn, it's broken. So it's overwhelmed that tendon, right? But if you recover from that relatively easily, if that's not if that hasn't really anchored your psychology, if you've kind of healed from it and moved on, we would say that you've recovered from that. You've had a pretty solid, healthy recovery in relationship to that, and we would categorize that as a lowercase t. Once again, this is just an objective assessment. Okay, so from an objective perspective, that would be a lowercase t, compared to if you had a major car accident. Okay, so if you had a major car accident where, let's say, you broke a thigh bone, and that really changed, it was a very scary car accident for you, is life-threatening for you, and now you're going to always have to walk with a cane or some type of apparatus. Forever your walk will be changed because of this crack in the thigh bone. This is a capital T trauma. This is a larger trauma. This is a bigger thing for you. And in your own subjective experience, it has carried a lot more weight. It has a lot more gravity than just, you twisting your ankle or something along those lines and recovering relatively easily. So from an objective perspective, we would see that lowercase t to capital T trauma. This is one of the ways that we kind of talk about these things. And so the closer we get to medium to high T traumas, capital T traumas, the more there is a probability of disowning certain material around that capital T trauma. When we experience traumas, there can be a whole lot of different nervous system responses, stress response systems that kind of kick in automatically that we don't really have a whole lot of say over, and we need to recover from those. And oftentimes, because there's a lot of pain and discomfort or unpleasant things that go along with these capital T traumas, we oftentimes just shy away from them. We want to put them in the past or something else along those lines. There's some realities to capital T traumas being a little bit more intense. There is realities that, depending on your subjective experience of any trauma, you can weigh it, or it can carry a little bit more weight in your world and carry a little bit more severity in your world, depending, even if it's from an objective perspective, not a big deal. The subjective experience has to be added into the equation as well, and can have a different effect on us. So what we want to do is we want to identify that when it comes to shadow, we kind of split them up into two categories. We have the shadow that we can, the portions of our shadow can be having to do with our natural elements as a human being that we've disowned, or it can have to do with traumas that we've disowned. Okay, traumas that, and it may just be elements of traumas. Okay, so we may be able to talk about, or we may be able to relate to some of the information about a car accident, but some of the other material may be really uncomfortable for us, maybe really throw us into an agitation of anxiety or numbness or something else along those lines. And so that would be territory that we'd want to be interested in kind of pursuing as far as shadow work is concerned. And that's kind of going to define how we proceed beyond. Okay. Now, we are splitting these two up just out of happenstance. It's just easier when it comes to explaining or educating about trauma. This is an easy way to kind of talk about it. It's sometimes when educating, it's not a bad idea to compartmentalize information. So right now we're compartmentalizing information and kind of splitting some things up. And it's good to kind of be aware of that stuff. And that's good and that's helpful. But we also want to remember that there's a lot of things that, as far as doing shadow work for recovery, full recovery, or doing shadow work for personal transformation, there's a lot of similarities that cross over between the two of them, primarily because shadow is about whatever that disowned quality is, whether you've disowned an experience, elements, an experience of trauma, or you've disowned elements of your humanity. No matter what you've disowned, we do shadow work all the same way, and we kind of play and explore shadow material and explore that which we have disowned in the same way. And we see a lot of the same responses out of the physical body and out of the psyche, whether we're doing it for, quote unquote, doing it for full recovery, or quote unquote, doing it for personal transformation. So one way or the other, I mean, we're still doing shadow work. So some of this is going to look really similar. It may sound like I'm being redundant when we touch in on this stuff, but there are nuanced differences that hopefully we'll touch on. Okay. And so when it comes to personal transformation or for full recovery, that's kind of how we originally delineate these two, of working with disowned elements or disowned trauma, kind of speaks to why the relationship to full recovery or personal transformation. So when we talk about doing shadow work for full recovery, we're doing shadow work in order to support the aid in recovery from trauma. Okay, so that original compartmentalization kind of comes into the longer conversation of full recovery. So when we start to look at shadow work in relationship to full recovery, what we want to do is we want to think of I'm slowly going to start walking towards that which has been uncomfortable for me. So most of the time, traumas are not the first thing people want to talk about. Okay, when we get together in social spaces, especially if we're kind of new to each other, we don't just kind of sit around and start talking about our traumas, especially talking about our traumas in very vulnerable ways. Maybe we're talking about traumas in a clinical way or an objective way or in a way that we are comfortable with, but we don't talk about our traumas in a way that is risky to us until we find out that we can trust the folks that are in our environment. And that's exactly how it ought to be. I mean, you ought to be able to trust who's in your environment. You should be able to assess and judge who is trustworthy in your environment before you start disclosing information. So we at ITB are in full support of that. So when we start looking at why should we do shadow work for full recovery? Full recovery is a full integration. Okay, full recovery is defined as a full integration of trauma. It's considering that trauma never heals. It is integration to the best of our ability in that moment of us engaging it. So for me in my life, if I've had traumas with my father, then me looking at that trauma and processing that trauma was different when I was 15, when I was 18, when I was 25, when I was 30, and now that I'm 40, into my 40s, I should say. It's different throughout those ages. And so it's the same, it's a similar trauma. It's just there's more growth. And from my perspective, I have become more, I have evolved. So my relationship to that trauma will then evolve. But full recovery is meant to be, to the best of my ability, a full digestion of what I can get at this point in time, with an understanding that I will be able to take in more later on, most likely. So shadow work in service of full recovery is important, because when we look at trauma, there is a very curious thing that comes up when it comes to trauma. When trauma occurs, we have these responses. When we are threatened, when our physical body is threatened, when our humanity is threatened, we have these things called stress responses come up. These stress responses, you've probably heard of them. These stress responses are probably commonplace. The first two are pretty commonplace. They call it fight or flight. So you've probably heard of this. When a stress response, when a stimuli that's threatening to us comes up in our environment, the first two responses that we go for is, I'm either going to fight this thing that's threatening my life, fight and try and kill this thing, or at least subdue it so I can get away. I'm going to fight this thing, or I'm going to run away from this thing. Now, both of those responses, both of those stress responses are valid and useful stress responses, and they come from our history on planet Earth. It appears, science tells us that every creature with a relatively advanced nervous system has this type of response as far as its life being threatened. It's either going to fight back or run away, depending on what resources it has at hand, what physiology it has as a creature, as a being. So fight and flight are extremely old on this planet. We are the benefactors of that, like a lot of other contemporary creatures, advanced and dynamic creatures on the planet. So we have this fight or flight system, but we also have some other stuff. So beyond fight or flight, we have the next intensity of response is a freeze response. So before I go much farther, what I'd love to do is I'd love to give you like some reference material for that. So if you want to learn more about this, you can look up a gentleman by the name of Dr. Peter Levine. Dr. Peter Levine is a is the founder of SomaticExperiencing. I highly suggest you read over his material and learn about somatic experiencing, and learn about the value of these things, learn about how trauma occurs and how it exists, how PTSD falls into place, and what factors contribute to symptoms of PTSD being in place for a human being, and also how to recover through that somatic experiencing process. I find that somatic experiencing is far and away probably the most efficient response to trauma and trauma in humanity and trauma in cultures right now. So if you're interested in learning more about this, not just from what I'm regurgitating here, then a wonderful source for this will be Dr. Peter Levine. So check him out. He's phenomenal. So Dr. Levine talked about this experience of when stimuli, the most superficial response of a stimuli hitting us, a life-threatening situation coming up, and the most superficial response is the fight or flight response. That's the most typical one. Okay, that's the most superficial, most top layer of it. And the difference is that if that life-threatening experience, if that life-threatening stimuli sticks around for a long period of time, then the stress response goes into a little bit more of a severe kind of a space, which is what's considered a freeze response. And so from fight or flight, if things stay bad, we're going to fall down into a next layer of trouble, which is a freeze response. And then for freeze responses, we will start to see the first real kind of separation of high brain function and low brain function. Now, granted, as soon as a life-threatening situation comes up, the brain activity kind of shifts. Okay, so from our normal cognitive experience of rationalization, thinking through things, high emotional intelligence, a lot of those things we call our more human experiences, that would be considered a quote-unquote high brain function, the more outer portions of our brain functioning that make us human and make us unique in those ways. So that's kind of our outer portion, our high brain functions. Now, when we have a high stress experience, what happens is that there's a split. The nervous system takes over, the stress response system takes over. So whatever's happening up here really gets kicked to the back of the bus and is not all that important anymore. What happens is that in order for the body to survive, for the systems to survive, for the creature to survive, they move into that lower fight or flight stress response systems in order to survive. And it's this separation that's a big problem. All right, because hopefully fight or flight happens, we're down here, and then as the event ends, we go through a process of reconnecting and moving back up to our central awareness, moving back up to normal brain function and different things along those lines. That is where the problem arises, is how long do we stay in that low brain function and how well do we return to normal brain function? That has always been the problem. We'll talk about that a little bit more about why that's a problem in just a minute. We have the fight or flight. We have the fight or flight, which is one layer of trouble. The next layer of trouble is the freeze response. The freeze response is what most of us know as playing dead or playing possum or something along those lines. It's a way of still escaping the situation. It's a way of deterring being eaten or killed. So it's a freeze response. It's where the body goes into kind of like what appears to be a death response. There's not a whole lot of breathing going on. There's no movement. There's a very still kind of dead eye experience that's going on with it. So when it comes to our actual outside representation, if that threat is going on for a period of time, it's when we can basically go limp and just kind of not move, not fight, not try and get away, just kind of freeze into that experience, and are kind of in people's in the description that often comes up from folks and from my own personal experience of it, there's just a blankness that oftentimes goes on. And there's just not a whole lot of sensation. There's not a whole lot of feeling. There's not a whole lot of thoughts. There's just kind of like this empty blankness experience. And it's a way of deterring the predator or the stimuli from continuing to pester us or threaten us. This works really, really well in the predator-prey environment in the wild. Doesn't work all that well with human beings as far as predator-prey is concerned, but it'll do you in a pinch, shall we say. So at the freeze response, we have kind of like this void of sensation and this numbness that comes up. Now, this is a great place to talk about as far as the F's are concerned. If we have fight up here, flight right here, and then freeze right here, what we think about as far as what is the emotional content related to these three different types of stress response, right? So you might have guessed this already. What is the emotional response out of fight? Well, when you're fighting, do you feel sad? Do you feel afraid? Do you feel some other pleasant emotion or something like that? No, not likely. When you're fighting, you are angry. The typical emotion that comes up with the fight response is anger, and not just anger, but rage oftentimes. Okay, so it's this intense type of rage and anger and potency in order to fight against the stimuli. If we move down to flight, you can probably imagine the emotion that's associated with that. It's fear, and not just fear, but oftentimes terror, because your life is being threatened. So in the history of humans on this planet, and even creatures on this planet, the stress response didn't come into play unless our life was being threatened. So if a monster is coming to eat us, I'm not scared of the monster. I am terrified of the monster. So I am terrified and I get my ass out of that situation, right? So the fight experience is not just anger, it's rage. The flight experience is not just scared, it's terrified. And so the freeze response is not just any emotion, it's a deep kind of emptiness. It's a deep type of numbness. And I shouldn't say emptiness, because emptiness is a little bit of a different flavor, especially in the language that we come from here with ITB. But it is a intense numbness. It's an absence of emotional experience. Okay, so fight, flight, freeze. In freeze, we don't have any emotional material really whatsoever. We just have, we just have numbness. We have kind of like a vacancy of our experience, of our body and of our mind. There's kind of an absence of that stuff. And once again, these are levels of severity. So fight or flight are kind of on a superficial layer. If the damage, if the terror or the threat continues to stay, or we get caught, if fighting doesn't work and running doesn't work, and we're caught or we're cornered, and that terror, that life-threatening experience continues, we'll drop down into a more intense territory, which is that freeze response. All right, and that freeze response is definitely worse than the other two. The freeze response, you have to be there for a longer period of time. Major components, objective measurements we can use to identify why we would go into the freeze response would be inability to move. Like if you are immobilized for a longer, if you're immobilized to a certain extent, and then how long you're immobilized, those two objective perspectives, those two objective factors contribute to more intensity and contribute to how deep you're going to go into this storyline, because there is something underneath freeze, and freeze, below freeze is something even worse, what we call fold. And in fold, there's a deep separation from identity, a deep separation from your humanity, a deep loss of your humanity and loss of your experience of self, experience of body, experience of mind. And this has to go on. You have to experience trauma for a long period of time for fold responses to start to kick in. Okay, for fold experiences to occur, this has to go on for a very long period of time. You have to be immobilized for a long period of time. You have to be in threat for a long period of time. And this is bad situations. It's very unique situations at this point in time where people run into fold experiences. And in fold experiences, it's worse than freeze. So there's no emotions there. There's no sense of self there. There's no sense of support. There's no sense of being alive there either. So it's more of a severe situation. So we have our 4 threat responses. We have our fight, our flight, our freeze, and our fold. So those 4 all have a tendency to live in our body. And depending on where you come from, depending on what kind of trauma you've experienced, you will have experiences with these types of trauma, with these flavors of trauma, so to speak, with these levels of severity. I'm telling all of you this. I'm telling you all this information because when it comes to shadow work, this is what we're going to be creeping up on. Remember, we mentioned there's a split that happens when we have a stress response. Now, what's hopefully going to happen is that as the threat, to backtrack a little bit, as the threat goes away, we're supposed to unify back into the experience. The problem is that our human brains seem to be advanced in a certain way, where we have become advanced in a way where we can deny things, where we can repress sensations, repress emotions, repress components of our humanity, and even repress this, this ancient system, this stress response system, and even repress that to a certain extent to our demise, but we can still repress it. So what happens is we can have a fight, even if we just have like a fight flight experience. When we attempt to go back into normal brain function, we might not have gone through some of the full-bodied experiences of that integration for whatever reason. And there's a hiccup in how we came back together, how those two minds came back together. So how we went from fight or flight back up to normal functionality, and how those unified, and how I integrated all that information. There might have been a hiccup during that period. And then we would start to see maybe mild symptoms of PTSD starting to show itself. And if you had a freeze response experience, and this is your upper brain function and your lower brain or your stress response function, survival instincts happening, and it was a freeze response, as you attempt to come back to normal brain function, in our culture, what we find, since we don't have a whole lot of training on how to do that stuff, or we don't give ourselves a whole lot of permission to be traumatized, and there's a lot of stigma about traumatization, then we will almost always see some dysfunction occurring. And these days we call that dysfunction PTSD. So what should happen, let's talk about what should happen, and then let's talk about what shouldn't happen during that integration period of time, when the two brains should come back, when the two awarenesses should come back together. When the two awarenesses should come back together, what should happen is the stimuli and data and information from that stress response experience should start to come together and unify with higher brain function. This should happen because this supports survival in the future. So if I'm a human being that survived a bear attack, my nervous system is going to incorporate all that data from before, during, and after that bear attack into my survival kind of library. and it'll tell me, if you see these symptoms again, if you see these markers again, you need to be aware that this could mean that there's a bear close by and we need to proceed with intense caution. So that's why we want to integrate that information. If you have a bad experience, we don't want to toss it out. And the reason we don't want to do that is because that's going to decrease your probability of surviving a possible bear attack in the future. So if we put this in a little bit more of a normal context for us, in the current day and age, if you're walking through, if you're in a social space and there is a threatening human being in your environment and actually attacks you, what we want your nervous system to do is gather the data from before the experience of the attack, from during the attack, and from after the attack. So since you've and hopefully you've survived the experience, once you survive the experience, you'll be able to have that data available to you. Your nervous system and your body will have that data available to you, that information available to you. So if there's another human being in your environment that looks a little threatening, you'll be able to assess that. You'll be able to assess them, and that may give you a leg up as far as survival is concerned. You may be able to completely sidestep that situation simply by, if you're a person who has been who is prey in a certain scenario and there is a predator, simply you being awake to the predator's presence oftentimes decreases the probability of the predator's success because they're being seen. But if you're a prey who's even been attacked before, but you've decided not to feel those emotions and feel those experiences, it's going to lower your probability of identifying that predator. It's going to lower your probability of paying attention to your environment, and it's probably going to increase your probability of that predator being like, oh, they're not paying attention, they're not participating, so I'm going to attack. So it doesn't mean that if you have been preyed upon, it doesn't mean that it's your fault. I'm not going to paint that goddamn picture because that shit's not true. I'm simply trying to let you know that there is a reason why we should pay attention to our history of trauma, engage our history of trauma, integrate our history of trauma. And there's a good reason for doing that, because it supports our thriving and our growth in the future. So I want to preface this story with this type of an idea because there's a really good reason why we want to integrate trauma. So if you're a person that's experienced that, then what oftentimes happens is that if you have been a person who has survived an attack in some form or fashion, or survived a scary situation, you are a survivor. You are putting your life together. You are trying to thrive. And what this means is that we're wanting to take that information from the event, and we're wanting to, even though it doesn't feel good, we're wanting to relate to it and understand it and hear it and allow it a place in our life. Because if we don't, what happens is, this is my normal brain function. This is the trauma. This is the stress response from the threatening situation, from the predator attacking. And as it comes back in the body, there's an incoherence. And so instead of unifying and going through the integration process, there's a incoherence. There's like maybe a non-sticking one. They're not allowed to function correctly. Okay. They're not allowed to integrate. And they're not allowed to integrate for us human beings most of the time because we are scared of the feelings. We are scared of the experience, and rightly so. I mean, hell, we were threatened. We were attacked. We had a life-threatening experience. Of course we're going to be uncomfortable. Of course it's going to be scary. No kidding. And that's for every human being in the world. But what we want to do is we want to go towards and allow that fear, that terror to be inside of us, to change us, to affect us in order to integrate for us. Okay. And so what we suggest is learning some practices in order, and giving yourself permission to be a human being that needs to integrate. Because what happens most of the time, we have found, is that there is this story in our culture that even if you're attacked, you should be fine afterwards. It's over, it's done, you should be just fine, you can go back to being who you were afterwards. And this is a farce. This is a complete myth. Okay. Once you are attacked and you survive, you are changed forever. You are a new human being now. You're wiser, you are scarred, you are different. And so you are evolving into something else. And that's what we want to really, really focus on, is that if you've survived some type of life-threatening event, you're forever changed. You're becoming now someone else. This is a beautiful fucking thing. This isn't a mess up. This isn't you becoming and evolving into someone else and becoming more integrated and more awake isn't a mistake, isn't a mishap, isn't a sign of weakness or smallness on your part. It's a sign of strength. It's a sign of health. But in the process of integration, it does not feel good for most people. It doesn't look good in most people's opinion, because during integration, what we see is increased respiration. So I breathe strange. I may have to feel that fear. I may have to feel that anger, that rage, and that terror. I may have to feel those things. That may feel very scary for my emotional sense. I may say, why am I feeling so rageful? I shouldn't be rageful. I should be a happy human being. I have a great life. I should be happy. I shouldn't feel anger. I shouldn't feel rage. Or the other side of terrified. If you survived and it was a flight situation, oh my God, I shouldn't feel afraid. I shouldn't feel so terrified all the time. I'm safe. There's good people around me. I shouldn't feel these things. If that's what's going on for you, then that's a hiccup. Okay. We want to clear the air and say, hey, listen, if you've survived fight, flight, or freeze or fold, you're going to have emotional content that comes up. And it doesn't mean you're a bad person. Doesn't mean you're stupid. Doesn't mean you're weak. Doesn't mean you're less than. Doesn't mean anything derogatory about you at all, quite honestly. It means that you're a human being with a nervous system that needs to integrate. That's all that means. So when we integrate, some signs that come up is some type of rapid breathing, some type of very sometimes dramatic respiration changes. All right. Sometimes no breathing at all. Sometimes you just hold your breath. We see this with freeze and fold responses. Breath just kind of stops or becomes such a whisper. You can hardly see the person breathing at all. They appear dead. And that's the point, actually. Other things that happen, intense emotionality. So like we said, fight has rage, flight has terror, freeze has numbness, fold has a void. And so if you have those histories, if you went that far, that deep into the trauma experience, guess what you're going to feel when you start to integrate? That's exactly right. If you went all the way down to fold, you're going to feel that disembodiment, that dissociative experience, this absence of your humanity and of life. Then as you deal with that for a while, you're going to come up a little bit more, and there's going to be maybe more numbness. There's going to be a sense of numbness. You may feel your body, but you're still numb. Then as you move through maybe those phases in a certain way, you're going to start to get these wisps and these hints of fear and of rage and terror. So, I mean, that doesn't sound like a great time, does it? Not at all. Okay. And this is why most people shy away from integrating trauma, is because these sound horrible. And the reality is that they are horrible. They are a terrible experience. Your life was threatened. It's not good. But we want to keep in mind that if I'm going to heal or recover, I have to keep in mind that this is a natural part of my humanity. It's a natural part of my species and nervous system on this planet. So if we can get over the hump of being so concerned about what that recovery may look like or feel like, what we may experience during that time, the threat and enormity of that possible material, if we can kind of work through that bit by bit and allow and trust our nervous system to do what it's made to do, we find something called recovery afterwards. We see healing occur. So the more we understand about this, the more real this becomes. And so we want to keep this in mind of, this is the story of being human on planet Earth. This is the story of what's going to happen when you get traumatized, because inevitably you're going to get threatened. Okay, inevitably you're going to have some type of threat to you. And that may be an enormous threat. It may be a medium threat. It may be a little threat. But you are going to experience a threat to your life on planet Dirt at some point in time. So this means that since this is a normal part of existence as a human being, we need to normalize the integration process. Those two brains, those two awarenesses, those two nervous system responses coming together and integrating. And so change of respiration, change of emotion. Sometimes sensory data comes through, smells from the experience, sounds from the experience, even sensations from the experience can come up. Thirdly, oftentimes there's a mimicry of movement. There's a mimicry of the body. The body has these physical expressions that it wants to go through, these physical releases that it has to perform. Oftentimes those are contractions. Often those times, those are stretches. Oftentimes it means a change of the spine. Sometimes to use anatomical terms, a flexion of the spine and an extension of the spine. These are very, very, very old to the nervous system. And so this is why they want to come through the body. And this is how the nervous system seems to reintegrate any kind of threat or survival experience. So we want to be awake to that as a reality. This is all science. This isn't opinion. This is actual, verifiable, recreatable scientific method here. This isn't Jeff's opinion. This isn't somebody else's opinion. This is things that we have seen out of the natural environment, and we can empirically test them and measure them. So understand that I'm not just throwing to you an idea or a concept. This is an actual verifiable thing. This is as real as talking about the nature of your cardiovascular system, or talking about your respiratory system, or talking about, how nerves interact with muscles. This is not really up for debate. This is just what is. All right. So this is why we talk about it in ITB as being, we need to normalize what trauma looks like, why trauma occurs, and how it feels when you're having trauma, and what to do with it in order to integrate it. Now, most of the time in our culture, I'm talking about the US culture, but also many Western cultures, we do not make room for integration. Integration looks kind of scary because the person is panting, they're breathing in a weird way, they're maybe moving around, they're maybe making audibilizations, they're maybe twitching and contracting and feeling they're expressing rage, or they're expressing terror, or they look dead. These things, for a lot of the general population, may look scary or weird or crazy, right? So this is where the major hiccup is that we don't actually make space in our human culture for those things to integrate. That's a major rub, okay? That's one of the reasons why I created ITB, was to hopefully start to make spaces for not only education, normalizing this situation, but make spaces for people to actually have these experiences. This is what we look for in ITB. This is what we do in ITB. So these integrations, these physical expressions, auditory expressions, respiratory expressions that create this opportunity for upper and lower brain stress responses to kind of unify again, we call these unwindings. In myofascial release, craniosacral therapy, and ITB, we call these unwindings. These are releases of this type of psychological, physical tension in the body that is usually unconscious. Most people don't even know they're holding it. And so this is what we're attempting to do, is to release that stuff and allow for that to reintegrate, and allow for it to become, for the human being to become whole again. And release just simply means I'm letting go of contracting against the unwinding. I'm then releasing the tension and moving into the unwinding. I don't want to give you the inappropriate idea that you're like releasing it to the cosmos, or you're releasing it to higher power, you're releasing it, you're giving it away. You're not giving this trauma away to something or someone or somewhere. You're actually releasing your contraction about feeling it. That's what you're releasing. So you're releasing your obstinance, you're releasing your prejudice that this is a bad thing to feel, and you're releasing that hold and tension so you can actually feel it in your heart. So you're not releasing it for it to go somewhere. You're releasing your death grip on it so you can actually feel it, right? And that's what we're hoping for. That's the integration to occur. So I say all this information, I'm talking to you about all this information because this is paramount as we go towards the future conversations of why shadow work. Shadow work at this point in time, one of the major things we do with shadow work and full recovery is we teach shadow work so people can slowly start to walk towards that stuff. We use shadow work, voice dialoguing activities, the 3-2-1-0 process created by Ken Wilber and Integrals, and then also Doshin Roshi. And then we also talk about voice dialoguing and use voice dialoguing created by Hal and Sidra Stone. We use those techniques in order to educate people and guide people in their own inner exploratory process of finding out where they're holding those unconscious tensions. And we start with verbal kind of emotional, psychological play, because that can create some opportunities for them to normalize it and make it a little bit more accessible. And then we also incorporate body work with shadow work, body work with the experience, and guided unwinding process in order to give people the opportunity to become not only psychologically educated about these things, but then start to walk slowly but surely towards more and more unwinding. So we teach them, we educate them about how to breathe, that breath is going to occur, to trust their breath, about how to, kind of instigate some of the contractions, some of the curls, some of the stretches the body might want to do in order to give the nervous system a little bit of momentum, grease the tracks, so to speak, in order to get things moving a little bit more. So we coach them about not only the psychological side of things, but when we also coach them about the physical side of things as well. So the individual can become fluent in dealing with trauma and dealing with engaging what's alive inside of them. And when they start to have skills for engaging what's alive inside of them, they then start to self-integrate. When something happens to them or something's coming up in their own self-examination, they now have the skills and the awareness and education and terminology in order to engage those old traumas and start to work with those and start to integrate those. That's our great hope in ITB, is to create this opportunity for people to actually start doing this stuff and have the skills to both on their own, but then in safe groups or teams, to engage these traumas, engage this history that they live with, and that is a part of their existence, part of their life, not to get rid of them. Once again, not to get rid of trauma, but to integrate trauma so we relate to trauma instead of being possessed by our trauma. Okay. So this is a major part of our work in ITB, and that's what we use shadow work for in order to support full recovery. Let me check my notes real quick here. Some shadow work conversations also, or when we talk about the psychological side of shadow work, the psychological practices we do with shadow work, the coaching practices we do with shadow work, we talk about the more we do this shadow work, the more we start to undo some confusions and some kind of misinterpretations about healing and about trauma. This is part of our education. We educate folks about what these things are and why these things are. And as we educate folks, we start to undo some, poor perspectives or upside down thinking in relationship to trauma. One example of upside down thinking is that they can go back to who they were. As I mentioned before, if you've survived an attack or survived a life-threatening situation, you are forever changed. You can't go back to who you are. So that type of a mindset, with that type of upside down thinking of going back to who you are, is kind of like a magical thinking, or like this wish type of a thinking, and this wishful, magical, childlike type of perspective. And it's kind of a turning away from the facts of our reality, the facts of our humanity, that we are forever changed. And that doesn't mean we're changed for the worse. Change from a trauma doesn't mean you're worse. It just means you have to engage that trauma. And as you integrate that trauma, you're usually changed for the better. Now, granted, your body may be a little bit different. Your mind and your awareness is going to be different. You may express and exist in a different way, but that doesn't mean that it's wrong, quite honestly. It just means that you're wiser and you have been changed by your life experiences. And if we do this in a healthy way, we usually see some really wonderful, positive things. The majority of the time, people are very, very, very happy with the person they discover after integrations, because they feel whole, they feel fuller, they feel wiser, they feel, actually oftentimes they feel empowered, because they've both consciously and unconsciously absorbed the information from that threatening experience. And it oftentimes can create a lot of self-empowerment and self-confidence and self-awareness. So these are all wonderful things. These are all very, very helpful. And so there's a misnomer that I need to go back to who I was. If I've had a trauma, I need to go back to the good times. That's not the case whatsoever. We need to really kind of put down that kind of backwards thinking of going back to who I was, and think of, who am I now becoming? Who am I going to transform into? And how powerful that is and how potent that is. Another kind of upside down style of thinking is that I have to defeat this thing in order to heal. I have to defeat this cancer. I have to outwill this back pain. I need to, I need to conquer my addiction or something along those lines. And the upside down thinking here we want to do is, we point out to you, this is an adversarial relationship that's unneeded. Trauma is a part of you. What we find along the way is, when people with this type of a mindset, they believe they have to conquer their pain, conquer the injury. And this isn't integration. Conquering isn't integration. Conquering is adversarialism. It's killing the trauma. It's killing the event. And as we talk to folks, this is the problem. This is the major burden that we find about this mindset, is that they think they can kill the trauma, they can kill the injury, or they can conquer the injury and dominate the injury and then be good afterwards. And we want to really, really, really suggest against this. This is a very, very, very confusing and exhausting type of a mindset to take, because what we've noticed is that it creates more and more adversarialism within, and it decreases the amount of healthy integration. It's just like, instead of integrating, it's pound down that stress response. And this is a very, very kind of a dangerous relationship to our stress and our recovery. And it is a major hiccup for a lot of people that kind of view trauma as a weakness. They see that their body got hurt because they were weak, or they were wrong, or they did something bad, or they are bad. And this is just simply not the case. And even if you messed up and the trauma occurred, it doesn't mean you're a bad person. It doesn't mean you have to kill the trauma, or you have to kill the experience of the trauma. Or that you're inherently weak because your body broke in some way, or your mind broke in some way. Integration is real, and if we become friends with the trauma, friends with the pain, and make a healthy relationship of sharing, that's where we see true integration starting to arise, not in dominating this perceived weakness in you. This is a very, very dangerous orientation. We suggest strongly against it. If you're really, really interested in carrying and beating that drum, we'll do it with you, or we'll sit beside you as you do it. But we usually find what happens is you guys usually tire yourself out. You become exhausted and find out, fighting yourself is not a very good healing mode of operandi. And so this is a dangerous thing. We suggest, if you have to explore it, then do it. But we suggest it is, if you can make a choice in relationship to it, is a dangerous type of a practice. So we don't suggest that adversarial type of relationship with ourselves. Oftentimes we also do have this perspective that if I do something right, or if I play the game correctly, I'm going to be a better person. I'm going to get better again. And what we want to keep in mind is that we want to really, the reason we use in ITB this language, this term integration, is because it kind of cleans up a lot of the other, like poor perspectives of our humanity, and poor perspectives of the nature of our bodies, and that we can be damaged, and that we take trauma, and that we take damage. The more we see our body as flawed as we get damaged, the worse we're going to be at integrating trauma. So if we see an injury as a fault in our character, if we see an injury, or if we see that the fact that we got traumatized, or if someone attacked us and we survived that, and we are derogatory towards ourselves because we even took damage. If we say I'm weak because I took damage, or say I'm dumb because I got taken advantage of, right? We make a judgment of ourselves and condemn ourselves to being weak or stupid or bad at life or a sinner because of a trauma happening. This is once again going to cause a adversarial relationship. It is a poor, unhealthy relationship to the natural state and condition of reality and our humanity, the fact that we are fragile creatures. It's also, when we do that, we kind of deny any opportunity of integration, because we deny actually feeling that emotional content of the trauma. And so this is extremely problematic, all right? And we just want to be these are just a few, and we just want to be really careful about bringing up why these perspectives are in place, and these hiccups. And shadow work does a wonderful job at kind of pulling these things apart. So an example of this real quick could be, when we're doing shadow work, we could say something along the lines of, we could talk about that time travel, that wish fulfillment ideal of going back to who you were. If we sit down and start talking to that voice and start unpacking this belief system and this voice inside of us that it's saying, this character inside of us that is saying, if I heal, I can go back to who I was. We start to unpack why it wants to go back and how it thinks about that. What we do is we start to reveal the inaccuracies it has, how contrary it is to the natural order, how contrary it is to integration and healing, as science tells us it occurs. So we see how these voices and these perspectives and these kind of strong sensations of wanting to return to the days of old before the trauma, how we see how problematic they are to us. And shadow work helps us reveal that stuff. Voice dialogue and shadow work helps us, the way we do it in ITB, helps us understand those things a little bit more, helps us unpack them and love them and hold them and re-educate them, and how about how we can go forwards and actually integrate. And this can be a huge, huge experience for the human being. This is a hell of a fucking journey for most human beings that are integrating and working on their healing. So this is how shadow work supports full recovery. Now, shadow work, if we adjust the conversation a little bit, we can push towards shadow work being, how does shadow work contribute to personal transformation? Shadow work, what we've covered so far, shadow work contributes to personal transformation in kind of a similar way. Shadow work contributes to personal transformation because as we start to explore shadow work, once again, it is a lot of personal transformation is recovering what you've kind of disowned of your humanity. So especially in the beginning of a lot of personal transformation, it is a conscious choice to start to look at what parts of my integral map, what parts of my humanity was not okay in my family, you know? So when we look at the integral map and we start to get informed about the integral map, and we learn about the different territories of quadrants, stages, levels, lines, states, the more we learn about that, the more we start to notice, oh shit, there's a lot of stuff in my culture and in my home life that just didn't include these portions of my integral map. Like my culture or my family life, they weren't very integrally informed. So they only were informed about these certain components of my humanity or part of their existence. And so they're only going to educate and support the growth of those things. Okay. So you can come from a family or a culture that's terribly loving and wonderful and fabulous and all that jazz. But we also bump into the reality of like, there's probably gaps in that culture. There's probably gaps in your family's, way of relating to each other, especially when it comes to the integral map. And so what we want to do is we want to start to, when it comes to personal transformation, we include the integral map because we can combine the integral map with the shadow work practice, and we can start to investigate, how did my family leave out portions of the integral map? And we can use shadow work to start to explore those things that got left out. Also, something that comes up here as we start to do that, what we start to notice is that a lot of personal transformation is about this thing we call the identity, or this thing we call the ego. What we start to notice is that a lot of personal transformation is about making sure we refine, we uncover, and then also refine our identity, our ego. We start to spend time understanding the story, understanding what makes up our humanity, understanding what makes up, what was disowned, what components of ourself was disowned, what elements of us were disowned. The more we start to understand that, the more we start to be able to engage it and work that stuff. So if I know that as far as lines of intelligence are concerned in my family, if I know that the line of intelligence of emotional intelligence was not curated and supported and educated in, if I didn't have a whole lot of that in my household, or if it was flat out denied, then I know, all right, I need to spend some time learning about that stuff, and I need to start spending some time doing my shadow work in relationship to that. So what story, what ideas do I have to disown that emotional aspect of myself, that emotional intelligence in me? And the more I do that, the more I explore my poor relationship or my flat out disowning of emotional intelligence, the more I do that, the more I'm going to become acquainted with emotional intelligence, the more I'm going to understand emotional intelligence, the more I'm going to value and thus also maybe curate and build my emotional intelligence. So shadow work in personal transformation is an essential element in as far as the beginning and the middle component of shadow work, or of personal transformation, since personal transformation is very much about refining the identity in the beginning. So refining the identity in the beginning in service to recognizing you need to transcend your identity. All right. And so a lot of personal transformation, a lot of enlightenment conversation has to do with the transcendence of the identity. And we find that if you use shadow work to identify your identity, to uncover the shitty side of your identity, to uncover how you are cruel via your identity to yourself and to anyone else, the more you can do that with your shadow work, the more it decreases the probability of you being cruel to yourself and cruel to other people, the more it increases your probability of supporting other human beings, the more it also contributes to the opportunity in the long run of you identifying, holy shit, all these nuances, all these elements of my identity from the integral map, all these voices, all these stories, all these traumas, all these, arrangements, all these views, all these perceptions, none of these are actually me. So it supports, shadow work supports not only the education of the integral map, but then also the uncovering of the bullshit that we put on the integral map and the bullshit that we have about our confusion, that we are our identity, that we are our thoughts and beliefs and emotions and ideas and education level and gender and sex and race and political orientations and philosophical orientations and religious spiritual orientations. Shadow work helps us unveil the fact that we are not those things, that those things are simply tools of the human experience to express reality, to express what's alive inside of us. They are not actually who we are. So shadow work in relationship to personal transformation is paramount because it unveils the lie that we are our body, that we are our mind, that we are our emotions, that we are our creativity. It uncovers, unveils that lie, and it reveals the nature of our wholeness, the nature of our undying quality. And so this is a beautiful thing that shadow work contributes to. So let's see if I hit some of these things as far as my notes were concerned. Yeah. Fuller investigation, real is the tools of embodying profession, not who we are. Okay, cool. Got that one. Contributes to ego cleanup and refinement. Decreases, this is nice. I wrote some nice things here. Let me read this off to you. It decreases false aspects of our conclusions around integral map perception of reality. It reveals implicit and covert cultural, familial legacy, confusions, and fabrications. Covered that one. And then also clears projections and increases intimacy, increases ability to respond to not react. So this is an important one along the way also. A lot of us, we're all human beings, which means we all make relationship to other human beings and creatures and ecosystems and everything. We humans are in constant relationship to something. So one of the beautiful things that shadow work does for personal transformation, shadow work cleans up. Well, let me backtrack a little bit. Usually when it comes to shadow material, when it comes to our history, our stories, our poor orientations and relationships to these things, usually that shadow material, that which we have disowned, kind of infiltrates. We're walking around with it all the time. And if I'm talking to another human being, it usually infiltrates that, because shadow, one of the important things about shadow is that shadow tells us about the past. It informs us about what's happened before and not to do it again. And it also informs us about unconscious information that we're concerned about, okay, that we haven't quite digested, and different things along those lines. And it perks up the identity to pay attention for these things. So if you're talking to a human being and that human being maybe acts or looks like someone who has hurt you in the past or caused trauma for you in the past, you may actually start relating to the person in front of you as the person who traumatized you in the past. So you're not talking to that person anymore per se. You're relating to your trauma. You're relating to that person via your trauma. So this is one of the big mishaps. This is one of the major problems when we talk about two human beings in relationship to each other, whether they're friends, family, or romantic partners. This is the primary issue, is that one, let's say it's their romantic partner. The romantic partner is having an experience of one thing and talking about something. Me over here in relationship to my romantic partner is hearing and experiencing all this information, and it may cause me to feel past traumas, past agitations. I may not be hearing correctly what my romantic partner is saying. So this is all shadow material percolating up to the surface and getting in the way of me actually listening to my romantic partner, right? So I really want to hear my romantic partner, but I've got shadow in between us. I've got baggage and shitty stuff in between us. Very, very commonplace as far as relationships are concerned.
So one of the things that shadow work does is that it reminds me that, oh, as soon as I start to feel some of that material coming up in between me and the person I'm talking to, my romantic partner, I can say, oh, there's some shadow material that when my partner says these things, it creates this sensation inside of me because of my history, and I may be possessed by a certain aspect of my trauma or my shadow material. And so if they're saying that stuff that reminds me of that trauma and that shadow material, that stuff may come up. And I don't want them to be responsible for that stuff because that's not theirs. It's not appropriate to the actual dialogue even. So what we hope to do is that through enough shadow work and get to gather up that information and put it over here and work it later and continue to dialogue and connect with this person. Or if I know this person well enough, and if my romantic partner is aware of these types of things and what shadow work is and how shadow has a tendency to percolate up, when that starts to come up, I can come clean and say, you know what, as we're talking about this stuff, I'm having some of that material come up from my past trauma, and I'm hearing funny shit. Is that what you're saying to me right now? I'm hearing some stuff that reminds me of that trauma. And my partner can say, no, that's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm trying to get out of you. I'm just trying to communicate to you about this topic. And I can say, okay, cool. Put that to bed. That's not something I have to worry about anymore. And I can continue to stay intimate and closely connected to my romantic partner, to my lover. And so this is where we actually start to see some really, really cool benefits of shadow work with personal transformation, because it increases intimacy with anybody you're interacting with. Now here we're using the example of my lover, my romantic partner, but that means that you can also apply this analogy to your relationship to friends, to family members, even to enemies, okay? So in every relationship, it's not a matter of if there's shadow and baggage coming up, it's like how much shadow and baggage is coming up. So shadow is always present everywhere you are. How much of it is present and how much of it is working you is a varying degree. Okay, so with your romantic partner, you may feel a lot of shadow come up. With your friends, you may not feel a whole lot of shadow come up. With your family members, you may feel a lot of shadow come up. With your enemies, you may feel a shit ton of shadow come up. But it all depends on how much and what degree and how you're doing that day. But shadow work helps us become more aware of our wholeness and our humanity and how trauma exists in us. Shadow work teaches us what to do with it and how to relate to it and how to care for it and how to love it. Shadow work then, because we know how to care for it, we understand it, and we can get a sense for it, it decreases the probability of us forcing other people to work our shadow work for us, work our shadow material for us, I should say. And it increases the probability for me to have my own stuff, but then also be deeply connected to those who I care about, or deeply connected to whatever I'm putting my focus on. And so this is where shadow work for personal transformation can be phenomenal, because it creates this opportunity for you to manage your story and talk about that stuff and process that information and relate to that information, which is super duper important. But it also allows you to move beyond it, to hold it and integrate it and let it into your heart and feel it and let it be a part of your humanity, but not be possessed by it, which could be tantamount to transcending it. Okay. And in the transcending it through the inclusion of it, what we see is deeper intimacy in my relationships, deeper connection to whatever is arising. And for personal transformation, this is one of the primary goals in the community that talks about personal transformation, talks about enlightenment, talks about personal growth. Intimacy is one of the defining factors. So refinement of the identity and ego we get from shadow work. Learning how to care for and hold and relate to and integrate our trauma and disowned portions is what we get through doing shadow work for personal transformation. We also get major benefits of intimacy and deeper connection, deeper understanding, and deeper just connection and communion with whatever we're connecting with, whatever we're focusing on. So these are big deals in the personal transformation world, in the enlightenment world, and hey, let's get free world. These are major, major components, and this is why we keep shadow work in the dialogue when it comes to personal transformation. So once again, this has been a lecture on why shadow work is one of our 2 foundational practices. And shadow work, when shadow work is combined with witness consciousness meditation, we get some really wonderful type of material and whatnot. And this is what we're going to talk about next week, next Sunday when we meet. That is going to be the 27th. Let me double check that. That is going to be the 27th. And we are going to focus on that experience. We're going to focus on talking about having the dialogue of what does it look like when we put how witness consciousness meditation and shadow work together in order to create this opportunity for full recovery and personal transformation and our experiencing our whole humanity. So I've had a good time sharing this with you guys. Thank you very much. Thanks for participating. Thanks for showing up. My name is Jeff Koshin West. If you want to learn more about ITB, go to embodyingitb.org. You can find all kinds of information there. If you want to make a donation, go look up on, on PayPal, just look up Embodying ITB or Integral Transformative Bodywork, and you should find us there. On Venmo, look up at Jeffrey West 6 on Venmo. Please feel free to make donations. It's not expected. It's not an obligation. It would be wonderful, but once again, it's not an obligation. We do this for a specific reason. Please share this video with other people. If you have questions from what we've covered here, please mention the video that you're watching and then ask your question and send that to embodyingitb@gmail.com. And if you send that question and reference what video you were watching, I will be happy to answer that to the best of my ability. At least I should say not answer it, but respond to it to the best of my ability. So we want to thank you for paying attention today. I hope to see you next week. Find us at embodyingitb.org and check out what we're up to and support us. And we hope to support you and reach out if you need anything and have some information. All right. I wish you good rest. I wish you good food. I wish you good companionship. And I wish all of you a ton of ease and integration and fulfillment. All right. Thank you for participating. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.